Hey everybody, I want to welcome you to another episode of the After Show for Subtle Beast Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Webb, and I can't wait to interview Steve and Foltz about one of their latest podcasts titled The Other Side. Welcome back, guys. Excited that our host of the Subtle Beast Podcast could join us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
We've got Steve and Foltz in the house, and really excited to dive into what I think is very difficult topic. I have so many questions for you. I think the viewers will as well. And this episode was called The Other Side.
Right.
Now, on The Other Side, I have heard that you guys have attempted to record this podcast before, maybe once, maybe twice.
Yeah.
You scrapped it. You ultimately got it done, produced it, dropped it on the air recently.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with you, Steve, and just talk to us about why it was scrapped or why you didn't get it off the ground the first couple takes?
Yeah, absolutely. So we attempted the show first, probably within the first 3 months that we started the podcast. And it came up as an idea, and as we were developing the idea, so much went wrong. And the feeling around the podcast was so bad that after discussion, and I think it was during the night we were going to record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We started having like electrical difficulties. The lights were going in the room. Soundboard turned off on us. We started to record with what we thought the show that we had, and we had to pause in certain parts, and it was just coming off of pause and just taping us talking for like 20 minutes, and that content merged with show content that had already been edited.
It was a bad feel. It was a bad feel show. It was the first show we ever punted on. We'd never gone into a recording session and walked away without a show. So it was uncharted territory. It was
the stars were aligning.
It was something we had never done, and at one point we just both kind of looked at each other and bagged it.
Yeah, but we kept it in our wheelhouse, going for over 3 years, adding to it,
adding the information,
sharing different things that we didn't know about each other.
And then when this show came to fruition, and it ended up being an hour and 26-minute show, and I felt comfortable during the show. I know Foltz felt comfortable during the show. Yeah. The back and forth was real good. The information was real good. I was really proud of it. I think at the end it turned out to be a great show.
Yeah, I was super proud of it.
Well, once again, I think you guys nailed it based on just how much research you had to do, and the topics that you covered were vast and varied. And I'm just wondering, Steve, do you have a favorite part of the show that came out for you while you were recording it?
I do. When I started to think about the show, and when I listened to the show back, I thought that what my favorite part would be was when people that had died came back and told us what they saw or what happened to them or what their experience was. Right. Because that's fascinating. But in the end, when I listened back to the show, my favorite part ended up being what these spirits physically manifested and did. For example, when the guy woke up and his iPhone was open and there was just scribbles on note after note. Mm-hmm. Or when the guy would wake up and the country music station would be playing country. He didn't listen to country, but the ghost liked country. Yeah. So the rocking chair really got me.
Yeah.
That was my favorite part of the show, and I didn't go into it thinking that.
I think every story that you told on that show got to anybody who would be listening. There wasn't one story or anecdote that you talked about or a statistic that you just kind of tuned out on. It was just very...
I agree, it was captivating.
Yeah, and it did. And you had said that it made your hair stand on end.
Oh, for sure.
Just talking about it and recording it, and I can see why. So I find that really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. What about you, Foltz? Do you have anything that was one of your favorite things that came out of it?
One of my favorite parts of creating the show, during the actual creation of the show, was to learn that a buddy of mine who was in Special Forces, which is probably around the last 5 minutes of the show, had a friend who was in special intelligence in Israel, like Mossad, and basically broke down what he believed and what they believe is what happens to you when you leave the physical world, and it's pretty amazing, and I tend to lean towards that.
It was so amazing that when we were putting the show together, that was our closer. We ended the show with the Mossad information because it was really gripping.
Steve, you also said early on in the podcast that this stuff really scares you. Just talking about it and diving into it.
Yeah, it does.
And then the first example that you guys gave was it was a very beautiful example of a woman who had experienced an NDE for herself, and she was talking about that, and you were breaking that down for the audience.
Beautiful.
Right, yeah, that's how she explains it. So there was a woman that had an NDE, and she comes back, and she says, it was beautiful. I was in a field of flowers. And she goes on to explain the scene that she was in as she approached death. But when we broke it down together, what we realized was that nothing else was living in this beautiful scene that she had created in her mind or wherever she went. She was alone.
So imagine finally getting everything that you ever wanted, but had nobody to share it with. What would it matter?
Yeah,
you know?
that feeling of aloneness, I think, was part of her afterlife. Like,
that was part of maybe her purgatory, or part of her maybe even hell.
Yeah, I agree. That could be an individual's hell, is just not having anyone and just not having any living creature. She was in this field, in this beautiful field, but nothing around her was alive.
No human conversation and no human touch. After a certain point, you would start to crack up.
Yeah.
Well, much of the show focused on NDE and near death experience. Mm-hmm. Skeptics have said that there is nothing halfway or near about it. That dying is quite absolute, whether we return or not.
I agree.
So you agree with that?
Yeah.
Interesting. Others have said there are no words for the experience because we are talking at a level for which we don't have a language. Now, for me, I had a hard time just wrapping my head around this show and researching what skeptics say kind of rang true, and you're saying you agree. I was wondering if you could just, Fultz, you could help make some sense of what all this is.
Sure. Well, let's say, for example, that you would have an experience, or we'll just say an NDE, for example. Let's say you had one, and wherever it took you, it was the most beautiful place you'd ever seen, but you had seen and saw colors that you had never seen in your life before, a vision of the spectrum that you didn't even know existed. When you came back from that, how would you describe that color to somebody who has never seen it before, would have no comprehension of that shade, that tone, what you're even talking about? You couldn't describe it. It could also be explained as the same as trying to explain yourself on the level of a cockroach. You can't get that type of information through.
Yeah, so it's almost impossible.
Correct.
Is what you're saying.
Correct. I mean,
and that's what
you
you're
can
dealing
try.
with.
You can try your best, but I mean,
you're not getting through to a cockroach. You're not going to get that information across. You're not going to explain the depth of that color you saw when you had your experience. You're not going to be able to ring true to that.
First of all,
that level of color.
How do I know that how I see red is the same way that you see red? We identify it as red, but how do we know that we both see it the same?
Well, I think you did actually make sense of that for me then, and I think for the audience too, because
well, good.
Lot to wrap your head around.
I mean, it is.
Yeah, it is.
Fultz, you told us a great story about your great-grandfather during the show. How did you come to have a knowledge of that story?
From my paternal grandmother. She was of Italian descent, and she used to always tell stories. I mean, my grandmother, she was very in tune with what you might say the other side. I mean, she used to do things like have little seances in her house with this 3-legged table, and this table used to start rocking. And she used to ask, because we were raised, and she was very, very religious Catholic family, and the table would start rocking like really violently, and she would ask the table, "What do you want? Do you want prayers said? Do you want us to have mass said for you?" Which is church, for the Catholic. And then the table would start to slow down, and it would stop, and it would stop, and it could be scary. But with the story with my great grandfather was he was in the Great War, and he was put on the pile of the dead. Now, what he said was he saw a vision of Saint Joseph reaching out his hammer to him. So he reached up to grab it, and when he did, he literally did that. And they said, "This man over here is still alive. Pull him off the pile of the dead."
This is an amazing story.
I know. It's just I could listen to you talk about this.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know, Steve, you could too. I think that's just a great story. And so you touched on growing up Catholic and having a Catholic family, Fultz. Do either of you have any knowledge if Catholics perform exorcisms today?
Well, I'm pretty positive that they do. Growing up, my mother was a teacher in a Catholic school, elementary school, I guess K through 8. But always was friendly and fond with the priests, and have them over to dinner to our house growing up. Almost quite all the time, like every weekend. And yeah, there were some that were assigned exorcists. Not all priests can perform them. It has to be, I don't know what you have to go through, but the whole process from somebody contacting you and saying, "I think that my child's possessed," to the priest actually performing it, it could be months to years, because it has to go to the Vatican, and it has to be eventually approved by the Pope, and then that has to come back, and then you have the permission to do it. But yeah, they're still done, and they're still carried out today. They probably aren't broadcast like people would think, like, "Oh my gosh, this person was possessed, here's a real life." The Catholic Church is known to keep things under wraps. We'll just leave it at that.
I didn't know that you had to run it the whole way up the flagpole to the Pope.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's been any done that we know of. I mean, have you guys heard of it?
Well, sure. Done? I mean, apparently there's Episcopalian priests can perform them, but they don't have to report to the Vatican. So sure that they would do them. They could do them upon the call of being called in. Upon first visit with the child or adult, whoever's being possessed. They could perform it. They don't need the permission.
Well, do either of you have anything personal you'd like to share about stories from the afterlife?
I don't. I've made my opinion of this kind of known. It gives me the jeebs. I couldn't even go through it the first time we tried to record the podcast, but Fultz has made me feel comfortable enough to record this. And you got some?
I do. Steve has probably heard this story before. My father actually always told a story of a house that he grew up in. He grew up in E-Town, Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. And he always said that it was haunted. And we always would ask, "Well, tell us the story about what would the ghost do?" Well, it would always seem to come in through their front door and slam the door, and you would hear like the old time blinds, but they didn't have those blinds on their door, but you would hear them. And then you could actually literally feel like a whoosh if you were on the steps of something running past you really fast. And then a few moments later, that same presence would come by, and you could hear it on the steps, but it'd be walking extremely slowly. Same front door open, shut, you'd hear the blinds, but there is no blinds on that door. Well, on one particular night when my dad and my mom were dating, my mom was at that house and they were both going up the stairs together. And the door opened and slammed and heard the blinds, and they both felt this whoosh come past them, and they could hear the footsteps up the stairs. And my mom would ask my dad, "What was that?" And he just basically said, "Oh, well, I don't know, it's probably our imagination." And she said, "We imagined the same thing." So then, here it comes back down the stairs, but slower, okay? And it goes up to the door, and you hear the whole thing again. But what they ended up putting together over time was, prior to my dad's family living in that house, the previous owner was an older gentleman who had a friend that lived across the street who was roughly the same age. And they used to come out onto their porches every day and overlooked a street. And they always said to each other, since we're always out here, we see each other every day, if one of us is never out here, come and check on us because something's wrong, because this is our routine. Well, the one day the guy came out and he was sitting on his porch and he didn't see his friend, gentleman, every day. So he runs over to the house, throws open the door, he runs up the stairs to find out what's wrong with his friend, and then later finds out, well, when he gets to his bedroom, that his friend had passed away during the night in his sleep. But the story thickens, and the plot thickens. It goes even further, because what happened is that same guy had actually died that same day, and what they figured out is actually came down to right around the same minute of the time when he noticed that his friend had died, because he had left his stove on with the gas running. And what was put together was, as soon as he noticed that his friend across the street had passed away, the gas in the house killed him, but his energy had jumped up to go check on the concern for his friend. Runs through the door, throws it open, slams it, runs up the stairs, goes into the bedroom, sees that his friend's dead, then slowly comes back down the stairs, sad because his friend's dead, opens up the door and leaves. So that's all the energy that was taking place in the house. That's what they had finally put together.
Oh my gosh, that is an incredible story.
Yeah, and we had been told that our whole lives. So you imagine as a child hearing that, every hair on your body standing up. You know?
My goodness, what a fantastic episode for Halloween time.
Sure.
Yeah. You guys covered everything. If you've not heard this particular podcast, I recommend you go look at it. Go listen to it, called The Otherside. You guys touch on everything from near-death experiences to poltergeists,
sure,
to pixies, and a whole lot of other things that we're not going to get into here, but
right,
just a great Halloween episode.
Well, great. We're glad you enjoyed it. And
Thanks,
if anybody has any further questions on that episode, put them in the comments below, and we'll get back to you.
Don't forget to subscribe.
Subscribe. Yep. We'll see you next time.